Hi, I'm Ari Martinez, and we are here in Panama. We are on Pipeline Road in Soberania National Park, and we're in a tropical rainforest, and it's the dry season. So one of the most amazing things you can see in a tropical rainforest, especially in Central and South America, are these marauding swarms of army ants. One species in particular, Aceton burchelli, you'll be walking through a forest, and as you're walking through the forest, it can be silent, and it sounds like all of a sudden that it's raining. And before you know it, you look down, and it's not raining. What it is the hundreds of thousands of ants swarming along the leaf litter. There's one phase of the life cycle, the hunting phase of these army ants, where they're maraud out in these huge fronts, and they're basically scavenging and hunting for any prey item that's available, living prey item. And typically they're insects, so katydids, crickets, and grasshoppers. And as they maraud, they flush a lot of these insects they're trying to escape the swarm, that are scurrying along the forest floor or flying away from the ants. So this is also a valuable resource, as you can imagine, for a lot of the other animals in the forest, especially insect-eating birds. And a lot of these birds will eat insects as they're available. A few species in particular that have evolved to follow these swarms on a permanent basis. And so they will stay at the front of the swarm, and they're jockeying for position, making all these sounds. And as they do that, other birds will join and leave the ant swarm following bird flock that is forming and changing constantly throughout the day as these ants maraud. So what we want to know is what kinds of information do birds use to try and locate and evaluate whether it's a good idea to go to these ant swarms that are generating this valuable food resource. And to think about that, what you should think about is what kinds of information are these birds might cue into, given that there's species that are always there, that this flock is changing constantly in terms of the number of individuals and species, and what kinds of information you might listen for as the flock moves throughout the forest. So there's a lot of interesting questions here, but what we're interested in is how do birds use vocal cues to find ant swarm flocks? What kinds of vocal cues do they use? Well, we've already conducted the experiment over a year ago, and now what we want to do is analyze the data. So to do that, we want to basically compare how the responses to the different sounds varies, right? And to do that, we want to do a statistical test. In our case, what we're going to do is a generalized linear model, which allows us to take into account the structure of the data and compare the different sounds. And in this case, we're comparing counts, right? Counts of numbers of individuals and counts of number of species, and how that varies in terms of a response to these three different sounds. And that will allow us to decide which of these hypotheses is most likely explaining the patterns we see, right? In terms of, does the type of species account for most of the pattern we see in terms of the response, or is it the number of individuals in terms of that kind of sound? Is that explaining the response of birds coming into these sounds, or is it the number of species that are coming in that is explaining the number of individuals and types of species that are coming in to a sound? There are three different types of hypotheses that we want to evaluate in terms of determining what kinds of vocal cues birds use to locate and evaluate whether they're going to go to an ant swarm. The first is the level of dependency of the species. In other words, do birds evaluate information based upon the fidelity of a bird to a swarm? Do they value information coming from birds that are permanently at a swarm more than they value than birds that are frequently at a swarm or that occasionally join the ant swarm. The second thing we want to know is, do they evaluate the number of individuals? If they hear few individuals versus lots of individuals, is that indicative of the size of the swarm? So would they value that information most? And the third thing is the diversity of species that they hear at a swarm. Is the diversity of species at a swarm, in other words, lots of species versus few species, indicative of maybe lots of different types of prey versus few types of prey items that might be available for them in a swarm? And so those are the three hypotheses we want to evaluate in terms of the type of information that birds use and evaluate to decide whether they're going to go to swarm. One is the type of dependency, and two is the number of individuals, and three is the species richness, or the number of species that they listen into. To test these three different hypotheses, what we did was a playback experiment. And a playback experiment is basically taking the different sounds that we're interested in and playing them back and trying to measure how species respond to that.
People think, you need a lot of fancy equipment to do an experiment, and all I've got are some homemade speakers a friend of mine made. Right, these plastic speakers here. Made some Tupperware. They've got a tweeter and a mid-range speaker, and they've got an amplifier in here, right? And what's great about these is they're waterproof, right? Because we've made them out of Tupperware, which is really nice, because in the forest, right, you don't want to have a really expensive speaker and have it get ruined. So you turn it on, right? Got a lithium polymer battery in there.
In this case, what we're looking at are these three different types of sounds, right? We're looking at a playback experiment where we simulate and play back the type of species. Then we also do a sound where we play back the different numbers of individuals of birds. And then we play back a sound where there's different numbers of species of birds. And what we do is we went to the forest in Gamboa National Park, and we'd established 6 different points in the forest where they were about 500 meters apart, so the points were independent. And we would play back these different sounds at each of the points only once each morning, and play back these different sounds to see how the different numbers of individuals of different species responded in the forest to these sounds. So we would randomize the order that we play back these different sounds, and we would measure and count the number of individuals of species during a 30-minute period of an experiment. And in that experiment, we'd have a 10-minute period where we wouldn't play anything. We would just survey and count the number of individuals of species. Then we would do a 10-minute trial period where we would actually play back the sound that we're testing, and we would measure the number of individuals and numbers of species that responded, and would come in basically to the sound. And then we would measure a 10-minute post-trial period where we would measure the number of individuals and species that responded after we played back the sound. These are the types of things that we would measure, that these counts, and we would compare basically the individuals and species that would respond to these different sounds, and use that as a measure of the strength of the response to these different cues, right? These sounds are representing different vocal cues, and we would compare those across the different types of sounds that we're listening for.
Right, so you have 2 speakers, right? So it alternates the birds, simulating different species of birds. Right, so that's what we call Halakalax nebulioides. That's the spotted antbird, and that's one of the antbirds that that is from the understory. And this is a bird that sometimes is at swarms and sometimes isn't. So this would be one of the factors we play.
To analyze the data, what we're going to do, right, is compare the different sounds that we've played back, and we want to compare how individuals and species respond to the different sounds, right? That's the response. And so we want to, by comparing it amongst these different sounds, we're comparing the different hypotheses in essence. And what we're going to do is use a statistical test. There's lots of different tests out there, but what we're going to use a test that's in a family called generalized linear models, which basically allows you to do an analysis and take into account the structure of the data. And so by doing these tests, we'll be able to compare which sounds have more of an effect in generating a response by numbers of individuals and species, and the ones that have greater responses will be the hypothesis that has the strongest support. So we'll be able to compare amongst these three hypotheses and see which one has the best support, right? The type of species versus the hypothesis that says number of individuals matters versus the hypothesis that says the number of species matters in influencing the numbers of individuals and species that come in to an ant swarm, right? And that's what we will test. And what we found so far is that definitely the type of species matters. These permanent birds that are always at the swarm seem to have a lot of influence in terms of attracting different bird species and individuals to the swarm, as does the number of individuals that we play back. So once we have our findings, we want to publish them in a scientific journal and make them available to the scientific community and to the larger general public. What's really important at this point in time is understanding how human beings affect habitats and how we are altering habitats. And one of our measures of seeing how we alter habitats is biodiversity. How are we affecting biodiversity? Well, a lot of us measure things like species diversity and how species diversity responds to human activities. But what are the mechanisms that underlie how we affect species diversity? Well, one of the things we want to look at are animal communication networks. And the work we're doing is actually seeing how animal communication networks function, and would hopefully give us a predictive basis for understanding how groups of species and therefore the larger community might respond to habitat alteration.